The sun glared down on Highway 85 as Officer Brent Maddox adjusted his aviators and took another sip from his gas station coffee. He leaned against his patrol car, parked just off the shoulder in a speed trap spot locals had come to resent. It was a quiet afternoon. Nothing but the occasional hum of tires on asphalt and the buzz of insects in the tall grass. Brent liked it this way. He'd already written up 3 tickets that morning and was hoping for one more before his shift ended. That's when he saw it. A black BMW sedan, clean, smooth, cruising just a few miles over the speed limit. Not enough to trigger a radar alarm, but just enough to catch his attention. The driver? A well-dressed black man in his 40s, wearing a tailored suit, sunglasses, and a calm expression. Brent's lip curled. He didn't even bother with the radar. He just flicked on his lights and pulled out onto the highway. Inside the BMW, the driver glanced at his rearview mirror and calmly pulled over. No sudden movements. Hands on the wheel. He'd been through this before, too many times. Brent swaggered up to the driver's side, one hand on his belt near his holster. "License and registration," he barked. The man handed over both without a word. Brent squinted at the name. "Julian Shaw?" "Yes," the man said evenly. "What brings you through Clayton County, Mr. Shaw?" "Business." Brent raised an eyebrow. "What kind of business?" "I'm not obligated to answer that, officer," Julian replied, his tone polite but firm. Brent didn't like that. Not one bit. He leaned down, staring hard at Julian's face. "You always this slick when you get pulled over?" "I always remain respectful," Julian replied. Brent narrowed his eyes. "Step out of the vehicle." Julian didn't flinch. "Am I being detained?" Brent smirked. "You're refusing a lawful order?" "I'm asking for clarification under the law." That was enough for Brent. He yanked the door open and motioned aggressively. "Out. Now." Julian stepped out slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible at all times. Brent pushed him against the hood, patted him down roughly, and muttered, "Think you're better than everyone else, huh?" Julian didn't answer. Brent found nothing. No drugs, no weapon, not even a parking ticket on record. Still, he wasn't ready to let go. "Pop the trunk." Julian turned his head slightly. "On what grounds?" Brent snapped. "Because I said so." Julian sighed and pressed the trunk release. Brent strutted to the back, Inside, a briefcase, a garment bag, and a Department of Justice badge. Brent froze. He leaned in. There it was, clear as day. Julian Shaw, Director, Office of Internal Affairs. For a second, the air went completely still. Then Julian spoke, calm, unshaken. "You want to try that introduction again, officer?" Brent's mouth opened, but no words came out. Julian reached into the trunk, lifted the briefcase, and retrieved a file folder. He flipped it open, pulled out a document, and handed it to Brent. "You're officially under review. Congratulations. You made the shortlist for an unannounced field audit." Brent's face turned a shade paler. "You set me up?" Julian adjusted his tie. "Number, you did that all by yourself." A second patrol car pulled up behind them. Out stepped a female officer in DOJ livery. "Director Shaw," she nodded. "Everything all right here?" Julian nodded back. "Just wrapping up." Brent was still frozen, the file trembling in his hands. Julian walked over, took back the folder, and met his eyes. "I suggest you start thinking very carefully about your next few words. They could decide the trajectory of your entire career." Brent swallowed hard. Julian turned to the other officer. "We'll be conducting interviews with his department this afternoon. Make sure HR preps the files." "Yes, sir." As Julian walked back to his car, Brent finally found his voice. "You people always think you can make us look bad." Julian paused, one hand on the door. He turned slowly. "You people?" he repeated. Brent tried to backpedal. "I didn't mean..." But Julian held up a hand. "You said exactly what you meant." Then he got into his car, started the engine, and pulled away, leaving Brent standing on the shoulder, sweat beading at his temple, not from the sun, but from the weight of a truth he could no longer deny. The Clayton County Sheriff's Department building was a squat brick structure tucked between a hardware store and a payday loan office. Inside, the air conditioning hummed too loudly, and the coffee tasted like cardboard. Officers milled about, some in uniform, some in plain clothes, most not paying attention until the DOJ team walked in. Julian Shaw stepped through the front doors with the authority of a man who had seen 1,000 versions of this place and wasn't impressed by any of them. Behind him, Officer Trent, his DOJ partner, carried a laptop bag and a tablet loaded with personnel files. The receptionist looked up and froze. "Can I help you?" Julian flashed his badge. "Director Julian Shaw, Department of Justice. We're here to conduct an internal audit and field review." The woman's smile faltered. "I wasn't told anyone was coming." "That's the point," Trent replied. Within minutes, words spread like wildfire. Officers whispered to one another. Doors closed quietly. Desks were hastily tidied. The sheriff, a thick-set man with thinning hair named Vernon Tate, came out of his office looking like he'd bitten into a lemon. "Director Shaw, I presume," he said with a forced smile and an outstretched hand. Julian shook it. "Firm, no small talk. We'll need access to your personnel records, disciplinary files, body cam footage archives, and internal complaint logs. We've already subpoenaed the digital backups." Tate's face tightened. "I'd appreciate being briefed before you speak to my officers." "That won't be necessary," Julian said coolly. The team split up. Trent took the records room. Another agent interviewed dispatch. Julian walked straight into the squad room, where half a dozen officers sat around pretending not to be rattled. He recognized Brent Maddox right away, sitting stiff at his desk, jaw clenched, eyes locked forward like a soldier under fire. "Officer Maddox," Julian said. Brent stood slowly. "Sir, we'll be using interview room C. Bring your service weapon and your last 4 performance reviews." Brent didn't move for a moment, then nodded and walked out of the room. In the hallway, Trent met Julian. "Body cam footage matches your report. Stop was unprovoked. No probable cause. Also found 2 complaints from last year, both dismissed without interview. Pattern? Starting to look that way." Inside the interview room, Julian sat across from Brent, whose face was now a mix of defiance and dread. A camera recorded everything. Trent stood in the corner, silent but alert. Julian began, voice calm. "Let's start with yesterday's stop. Why did you pull me over?" Brent hesitated. "You were speeding." "No radar was used. You never clocked me." Brent shifted. "I visually estimated based on..." "Your visual estimation without supporting data resulted in a forced vehicle exit, physical pat-down, and a search of my trunk. Is that accurate?" Brent said nothing. Julian continued. "Do you make it a habit of escalating stops without probable cause?" Brent glanced at Trent, then looked down. "Not always. Just sometimes. Like when the driver looks like me?" Silence. Julian leaned back. "Let me be very clear. This isn't just about a bad traffic stop. This is about a pattern of behavior. Your record shows 9 complaints over 6 years. Excessive force, disrespectful conduct, bias. None sustained. Why do you think that is?" Brent finally snapped, his voice low and tight. "Because people like you are always trying to make good cops look like racists." Julian didn't flinch. "I don't need to make you look like anything. You're doing a fine job of that yourself." Brent's fists clenched on the table. Trent stepped forward. "We'll be conducting interviews with your recent stops, reviewing your body cam archives. Any attempt to interfere will result in obstruction charges." Julian stood. "You may return to duty. But do not leave the county. This is a live investigation." As they exited the room, Brent remained seated, staring at the table, his world shrinking fast around him. Back in the hallway, Sheriff Tate waited. "You're making a lot of waves, Director Shaw." Julian nodded. "That's what happens when water's been still for too long." Tate forced a laugh. "You know, not every officer here's a bad apple. I'm not here for metaphors, Sheriff. I'm here for the truth." The next day, Julian sat at a long table in the sheriff's conference room, flanked by Trent and 2 additional DOJ agents flown in overnight. The table was covered in files, tablets, and transcripts. A whiteboard in the corner mapped officer interactions, complaint patterns, and disciplinary outcomes. Julian looked over the data and let out a breath. 13 officers, multiple excessive force incidents, 5 complaints dismissed without proper review, 3 with no recorded interviews, 1 missing entirely from the file system. Trent added, all centered around traffic stops, involving Black and Latino drivers. Julian nodded. Time to go deeper. They called in Officer Camila Rojas, one of only 2 women of color on the force. She looked nervous, but determined. When seated, she glanced at the camera, then straightened her back. Julian opened. You've been with Clayton PD for 4 years. Your record is clean. You've never filed a complaint, but you've submitted incident memos, 5 of them, all related to Officer Maddox. All flagged and closed within 48 hours. Why? Rojas hesitated. We were told to maintain internal cohesion. That's what the captain said. Was there ever pressure not to speak up? Yes. From who? Mostly the captain. Sometimes Maddox himself. If you raised concerns, you'd lose shift preferences or get desk duty. Trent asked, did you witness bias-based policing? Rojas nodded. Yes, repeatedly. He would tail cars driven by minorities, make up reasons to stop them. He said, gotta keep them reminded who runs this town. Her voice shook. It wasn't a joke. Julian leaned forward. Why didn't you come forward earlier? Rojas looked down. Because every time someone tried, they were shut down. And I couldn't afford to lose this job. I have 2 kids. You were protecting your family, Julian said quietly. She nodded, silent tears in her eyes. We'll protect you now, Trent added. After she left the room, Julian turned to the others. This is systemic, not one bad officer. A culture of silence and protection. They spent the afternoon compiling evidence. Video reviews, interview transcripts, HR records. Trent flagged an old memo from Sheriff Tate to the captain. Don't bring DOE attention. Handle it internally. Julian highlighted it. By evening, Julian called for an all-staff briefing. Mandatory, no exceptions. At 6 p.m., the officers gathered in the training room, dozens of them. Some looked anxious, some defiant. Maddox sat in the back, arms crossed, jaw tight. Sheriff Tate stood off to the side, hands clasped behind him. Julian stepped to the front. My name is Julian Shaw. I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here because your department is under federal investigation. I don't want excuses. I want accountability. A murmur passed through the room. This isn't about politics. It's about trust. The community doesn't trust you because you've given them reason not to. And until that changes, you are a liability, not a protector. Someone muttered from the back. We risk our lives out there. Julian nodded. So does every decent officer in this country. And the good ones know silence protects no one but the guilty. He locked eyes with Maddox. This is your chance. Speak up, clean house, or the DOJ will do it for you. One way or another, the change is coming. As the agents began passing out forms, anonymous reporting sheets, direct complaint channels, whistleblower protections, something shifted. A few officers looked at each other. A couple leaned forward. One young recruit raised his hand. I saw Maddox throw a guy against a car for asking why he was stopped. I didn't say anything. I should have. Julian nodded. You're saying something now. That's what matters. Another hand. Then another. The wall of silence cracked. And Maddox, still in the back row, stood abruptly and walked out. The following morning, the DOJ team arrived early. Julian and Trent reviewed new internal memos flagged overnight by their analysts. One was particularly damning. An email from Maddox to 2 fellow officers with the subject line, "Clearing the trash," referring to a series of traffic stops targeting young black men. The language wasn't coded. It was blatant. Attached were images of license plates, with notes like, "Gang look," and "Watch this one." Trent read it twice, and then handed it silently to Julian, who closed the file with a grim expression. We've got enough to recommend suspension and criminal charges. At 10 a.m., Julian requested a private meeting with Sheriff Tate. Inside the sheriff's office, the atmosphere was tense. Tate sat stiffly behind his desk, pretending to be in control. Julian didn't bother with small talk. We've completed our preliminary audit. Officer Brent Maddox's behavior reflects not only individual misconduct, but institutional failure. You signed off on at least 3 complaints without follow-up. You let your captain dismiss red flags, and in doing so, enabled a hostile environment for both citizens and your own staff. Tate bristled. You're making it sound like I encouraged it. You didn't stop it. That's the same thing. Tate stood. Do you have any idea what kind of pressure we're under? Morale is already in the gutter. If you make this public, it'll destroy this department. Julian looked him square in the eye. Then it's already broken. They left the office without shaking hands. By noon, Maddox was officially suspended. The news spread fast. A press statement was released. The mayor's office responded with a vague message about cooperating fully with federal authorities. The sheriff's department tried to downplay it, but it was too late. Local news vans began circling the parking lot. People started showing up with signs. Some said justice for all. Read, Fire Maddox now. Inside the station, tension mounted. Officers whispered, doors slammed harder, the tension hanging like humidity in the halls. That afternoon, Julian met privately with a young dispatcher named Noah Bennett. He had requested the meeting through the whistleblower form. Noah was barely out of college, nervous, hands trembling slightly as he sat across from Julian and Trent. I don't know if this helps, but I saw something last year. Maddox stopped a teenager, black kid, couldn't have been more than 17. He brought him in for resisting, but I was on radio and heard the call live. The kid didn't resist. He asked why he was being stopped. That's it. Then Maddox cut his mic for 5 minutes. When it came back on, the kid was crying. Julian's face tightened. Was there a report? There was. But the body cam footage was listed as accidentally deleted. Trent spoke. Do you know who filed it? I think it was Officer Rojas. I heard her arguing with the captain after. But the next day, it was like it never happened. The kid's name wasn't in the arrest database, like it was scrubbed. Julian exhaled slowly. That's obstruction. Thank you, Noah. You did the right thing. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low over the parking lot and protesters continued to gather outside, Julian stood near the window of the second-floor conference room, arms crossed. Trent approached with a quiet knock. We've got 4 new officers requesting interviews. Anonymous notes in the Dropbox, too. They're coming out of the woodwork. Julian nodded. Keep it moving. Trent paused. You think this is going to hold? That it'll actually stick this time? Julian didn't answer right away. Then he said, It will if we don't blink. The DOJ's presence had now become the central story on every local channel. News anchors speculated about whether the sheriff would resign, whether Maddox would face criminal charges, and whether Julian Shaw's sudden audit would spark a wave of reviews across the state. But Julian didn't care about headlines. He cared about follow-through. That morning, Trent briefed him on overnight developments. The city council holding an emergency meeting. The NAACP chapters requesting a formal dialogue. Also, Officer Rojas submitted a sworn statement detailing 6 separate incidents involving Maddox and 2 other officers. Julian nodded. It's time to take this to the community. At 6:30 p.m., a town hall was held at the local rec center. Folding chairs lined up in rows, people filing in from all directions. Black, white, old, young, some skeptical, some hopeful. Julian stood at the front of the room behind a folding table and spoke without a mic. I'm here because accountability doesn't happen behind closed doors. It happens here, with you, and with us listening. There were murmurs, nods, a few arms crossed. A woman in the 3rd row raised her hand. What happens now? After you leave? We'll be issuing a full report, recommendations, possibly federal charges. But more importantly, we'll ensure systems are in place to prevent this from happening again. A man near the back called out, You going to arrest that cop, Maddox? Julian didn't flinch. We're building a case. The evidence is being reviewed by the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. If it warrants prosecution, it will happen. Another voice. What about the sheriff? He knew. Julian met the man's eyes. Yes, and his role is under investigation as well. Someone else asked. You ever been stopped like that before? Treated like you didn't matter? Julian paused. Yes, more times than I can count. The room went quiet. I joined internal affairs because I wanted to fix it from the inside. But some things can't be fixed quietly. That's why we're here, out in the open. An older man in the front row stood slowly. Well, I never thought I'd see the day someone in your position stood here and told the truth to our faces, so thank you. A ripple of applause followed. Not overwhelming, but solid, grounded, real. After the town hall, Julian stood outside in the parking lot for a while, tie loosened, sleeves rolled. The night air was thick with humidity and tension, but also something else, release. Trent joined him. They trust you. That's rare. Julian nodded. That's why it has to matter. They walked back toward the car. On the sidewalk, a boy, maybe 15, watched them pass. He didn't speak, didn't smile, just lifted his chin slightly in acknowledgement. Julian returned the gesture. That night, back at the DOJ temporary field office, Julian reviewed a video that had just come in. Body cam footage from an arrest Rojas had flagged a year ago. It showed Maddox yanking a black teenager from his car, shouting, "I don't need a reason. You look like trouble." The boy begged, "I didn't do anything." Maddox shoved him to the ground, hand on his weapon. Other officers watched. No one intervened. Julian clicked pause. The screen froze on the boy's terrified face. He looked over at Trent. "This is it." Trent nodded. "Let's move." At sunrise the next day, Julian stood outside the sheriff's department with a federal warrant in his hand. The DOJ team assembled beside him. Trent, 2 federal marshals, and a local prosecutor brought in for oversight. They entered the building without ceremony. Sheriff Tate met them at the entrance, flanked by 2 deputies. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice low, sweat already forming at his temple. Julian handed him the warrant. "You're being relieved of duty, pending federal review. Step aside." Tate didn't move. Trent said, "If you resist, it escalates. You don't want that." After a tense beat, Tate stepped back. Inside, the building was silent. Most officers avoided eye contact. Some looked relieved. Maddox was nowhere in sight. One of the marshals confirmed over radio that his home was being searched simultaneously under a separate warrant. Julian and Trent moved quickly, securing evidence, pulling digital logs, extracting phone records. A sealed drawer in the captain's office contained a USB stick labeled Incident Backlogs. On it were unofficial notes, names, dates, undocumented stops, off-the-record detainments. It confirmed what Julian already suspected. The system wasn't just failing, it was actively concealing abuse. By noon, Maddox was found attempting to leave the county. His car was intercepted at a rural gas station. He claimed he was just clearing his head. The marshals placed him under arrest without incident. When informed of the charges, civil rights violations, falsifying reports, obstruction, he said nothing. No outrage, no denial, just silence. As he was led into custody, camera crews surrounded the station. Protesters cheered. Julian didn't speak to the press. He didn't need to. The image of Maddox in cuffs said everything. Later that afternoon, Julian stood before the press in a formal briefing room at City Hall. Flanked by DOJ officials and the mayor, he delivered a short statement. Today's actions were not about vengeance. They were about accountability. Justice is not a slogan, it is a process. And today, that process moved forward. He answered questions without deflection. When asked what would happen to the department next, he replied, "It will be rebuilt from the inside out. Transparency, training, new oversight." Another reporter asked, "What's the message here for other departments?" Julian looked into the camera. "The message is simple. No one is above the law, not even those who wear the badge." That evening, the town square was full. Not with anger this time, but with something else, vindication. People held candles, some prayed. Others just stood quietly, shoulder to shoulder. On the courthouse steps, a group of local pastors led a vigil. A choir sang softly. Julian didn't speak. He stood at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed, his badge tucked away, his presence unannounced. But he was there, bearing witness. Trent approached, candle in hand. "You did it," she said. Julian shook his head. We did it, and now we make sure it lasts. In the weeks that followed, the Clayton County Sheriff's Department underwent the most sweeping reform in its history. Officer Rojas was promoted to interim captain. 3 officers resigned voluntarily. 2 were terminated after further investigation. DOJ training sessions were implemented, and body camera policies were rewritten from the ground up. Community liaisons were hired. Town halls became regular. For once, the department was being shaped by the very people it had failed. Julian returned to D.C., but his presence lingered like a watermark across every change. Local papers dubbed it the Clayton Reckoning. The footage of his initial stop by Maddox had gone viral, sparking nationwide conversations about racial profiling and internal accountability. Law schools requested him for lectures. Civil rights organizations cited the case as precedent. But Julian didn't lean into the spotlight. He declined interviews. He kept working. One day, while walking out of the DOJ building, he was approached by a young officer in uniform. She hesitated, then said, "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you. What you did in Clayton, it meant a lot. My dad's from there. He cried when he saw you on television." Julian nodded, moved, but quiet. "We're just getting started," he said. At home that night, he sat with a folder in his lap, his notes from the case, printed articles, photographs. On top was the original report from the day Maddox pulled him over. He read it again. Not because he needed to, but because he refused to forget how easily silence can bury truth. He thought of Rojas, of Noah, of that teenage boy who never made it into the system because someone decided he didn't count. They all counted now. Later, Trent called. "We got a request from Louisiana. Another audit. Similar complaints. Want to fly out next week?" Julian didn't hesitate. "Tell them we're coming." Before hanging up, she added, "You've changed the way people see this work. That matters." "It only matters if it keeps going," Julian replied. That weekend, he drove back to Clayton one last time. No badge, no press, just him. He stopped by the courthouse, then walked through the neighborhood. Kids rode bikes past him. An older woman sitting on her porch raised a hand in greeting. At a small community mural newly painted on the rec center wall, he paused. It showed a series of faces, local leaders, teachers, clergy, and in the corner, slightly to the side, was a small but unmistakable portrait of him, not in a suit, not in a badge, but in a simple collared shirt, looking forward. He stood there for a while, not smiling, just breathing. The mural wasn't about him. It was about everyone who stood up when it was hard. Everyone who told the truth when it would have been safer to stay quiet. He took one last look, then turned and walked away, already thinking about the next case. Weeks later, a national news segment aired titled "Justice in Clayton, When the System Looks Back." It opened with footage of Julian standing calmly during the traffic stop, then cut to images of Maddox being led away in cuffs. A narrator spoke over sweeping shots of the department reforms, the community mural, the town halls. In a world where accountability often feels out of reach, one man turned a moment of bias into a movement for change. The segment went viral. But Julian didn't watch it live. He was in Louisiana by then, walking through another precinct, reviewing files, asking questions. Quiet, focused. One of the marshals he worked with in Clayton texted him a link to the video. "You should see what you've started." Julian replied with a simple message. "We've got work to do." Back in Clayton, Officer Rojas now led the morning briefings. Noah had been promoted to senior dispatcher. The sheriff's office, under new leadership, had invited community members to sit on a new oversight board. And that teenage boy, the one Maddox had once thrown to the ground, had been accepted into a local mentorship program funded by DOJ grants. His name was Jalen Price. He'd started attending city council meetings and told his teacher he wanted to be a civil rights attorney. In Washington, Trent walked past Julian's desk and dropped off a thick folder. New file, new town, same story. Julian looked up and smiled faintly. Let's get to work. Because this was never just about Clayton, or Maddox, or one traffic stop. It was about who gets to be seen as human, who gets to ask why, And what happens when someone in power finally says, "Not this time"? Julian Shaw didn't wear a cape. He didn't shout. He didn't swing back. He listened, documented, investigated, and made sure the system heard the voices it tried so hard to ignore. And maybe, just maybe, that's what justice looks like. Not loud, but lasting.